Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being part of WCET's first live Google Hangout. Today we have Anya Kamenetz, and she is the author of the test, which I recently finished reading, and I thought it was a very, very good overview of testing, where we were, how we got here, and some really, really good suggestions for how we can move forward. As a parent of a young one, same with Anya, I think we both were a little compelled and a little shell-shocked by what it might look like for our kids when they enter school. So please go ahead and welcome Anya. She's going to do a brief overview of the book, and then we have several questions, and we'll be taking Q&A from the Twitterverse. Callie Morrison, my colleague here at WCET, located in Boulder, is going to be monitoring our Twitter, so we hope to have a pretty active dialogue. Welcome, Anya.
Hi, Megan. Hi, Kelly. Thanks for having me. This is really fun. I didn't realize this was your first live hangout. So my background is writing about higher ed, and when I turned my attention to K-12, I too was very surprised by the sort of extent of the testing that's going on in public schools and how it's coming to really dominate so much of the experience of schools for teachers and students and parents. But in connecting the concept of teaching, and I can talk a lot about sort of, do you want me to go by the overview of the book or more through the slides?
Your slides really resonated with me because it put a lot of the big concepts in very tangible bits for me. So I think that would be great. Do you want me to go ahead and do that, or do you want to do a screen share?
Can you do it, actually? I think it might be easier if you put them up. They also, anybody can look at them through this link up here.
Okay, so she did put the link there.
And that should be open.
Okay. Okay. Can everybody see that okay? All right, well, pretty quiet chat.
No problem. So in talking about, the watchword right now in higher ed is about competency-based learning. And the idea with competency-based learning, moving from seat time to mastery, is that you're going to directly assess learning, right? Instead of using a proxy. But if you're relying, what your assessments are doing. And so new concepts in assessment are coming to the forefront here on both the higher ed and the K-12 side because of the sense that sort of multiple choice standardized assessments of don't capture what we really, really want students to be able to know and be able to do, and they don't constitute demonstrations of actual knowledge. So I'm kind of scrolling through. There's a couple of different examples here. I've got a dashboard first that shows kind of a moment-to-moment. That would be sort of a self-assessment situation where you're giving very granular, very detailed information to teachers and to students and potentially families in a K-12 setting about participation and kind of tracking that information, very data-driven. The second slide here, the third slide here, is showing portfolio-based learning, and in the professional realm, Behance is an online social network where people can post their visual portfolios. So, illustrators, designers, and their work can then be voted on by a jury of their peers. Very pure form of portfolio-based assessment. You demonstrate the knowledge, you create a portfolio, you share it, and then you can go directly to the job market with that demonstration of knowledge. An illustration of the kind of how people are currently thinking about competency-based learning in action, the flexible option. And actually, I just realized I'm going through an old version of the slides. I'm so sorry. Let me go over to the current version so it can be in a little bit better order here. So sorry about that. Okay, so um, let's go on to the next slide where we're talking about growth measures, the types of learning, the principles of assessment that we want to institute here. In some ways, these are sort of like everything that, single, narrow, multiple choice tests are not doing. Showing growth, demonstrating authentic skills, including multiple measures, and testing a full spectrum of abilities. And then in the next slide, I talk about sort of the framework that I'm using for talking about the future of assessments in the tests, and that is going in order sort of Team Robot, which is a using technologically induced approaches to test sort of conventional subjects in invisible integrated ways. And then Team Monkey is using sort of conventional instruments like surveys to test unconventional qualities like emotional and social skills and abilities. And there's a lot of use now of large-scale surveys to sort of test the climate of a school or the engagement of students and teachers, and incorporating that kind of information, realizing how important social and emotional learning are to the practice and to people's success. Team Butterfly is how I talk about portfolio-based and performance-based assessments, which are obviously really, really important in the higher education sphere, but in K-12 as well. The idea of authentic demonstrations of knowledge that are interdisciplinary, that showcase presentation skills and research skills, as well as interest-driven learning. And this is a type of assessment that becomes really, really key kind of all the way down the line. And I visit some schools in K-12 that are focusing on performance-based assessments, and they seem to be very, it seems to be a practice of very high-performing schools. And then finally, Team Unicorn is the group that I say is sort of maybe the mythical future of testing. If we could somehow mash up Team Robot with Team Butterfly with Team Monkey and create assessments that are data-rich, that test higher-order thinking and social and emotional skills, habits, and mindsets in authentic simulated settings, but doing so within a very data-rich way that's comparable across, across instances of the testing. And the examples that I look at that are very nascent are in sort of game-based learning, game-based assessments. So here are some examples, again, returning to the Team Robot version of stealth assessment. And the idea here, instead of having this high anxiety, your interactions every single day, you kind of turn into the quantified learner, where the system, such as Khan Academy, is designed to be adaptive, which means that it's serving you the piece of content, the next best piece of content based on the answers you've already given. So with an adaptive learning software system, there is a two-way process of adaptation in some sense. So you as a learner are moving through the material, ideally you're growing and learning, and the software algorithms at the same time are sort of learning you as a learner, and the report backs that they're able to give then have uses in terms of prediction, in terms of analytics, giving red flags to teachers about how students are performing, helping give clues about how to give feedback and how to target, feedback and help and tutoring from the teacher. So it's sort of a technologically assisted learning process. Going down again through the next slide to that's another example of self-assessment. And then the performance-based assessment is a picture of Charlie Hall, who is a performance-based kid in 7th grade. He did this science project with his dog, Rosie, and he was a big sort of adopter of, this is at a school in Danville, Kentucky, he was a big adopter of the performance assessment sort of mindset, and it was really amazing for him to see it because he'd lived through the transition from a conventional school setup to a very performance-based learning setup, and he said, he learned so many skills about interest-driven learning. He learned about collaboration. He learned to respect the varying abilities and interests of his different classmates, and he said, let's get real. Nobody's going to be bubbling in answers at their jobs. With performance-based learning, we're actually practicing skills we're going to use in the real world. So I thought that was really really telling. And that's the Behance example, again, the portfolio-based assessment sort of for professionals or pre-professionals. And again, I mean, I see that connection, from whether it's a seventh grader or whether it's a grad student or someone in the workplace. The idea of packaging and presenting your learning, being able to reflect on it, be metacognitive, to network with others, these are all skills that are wrapped up in the performance assessment approach. The next slide's about social and emotional climate, the team monkey. Again, these instruments are kind of crude, basically just asking questions. You can't really attach high stakes to a survey. And this graph, unfortunately, shows what's called the school cliff, which younger students are more engaged in the process of school than older students, which maybe isn't too much of a surprise. It's kind of upsetting. But social and emotional climate surveys and sort of team monkey type assessments are really powerful when they're used as a basis for decision making and constant self-improvement on the part of institutions. The next slide is about sort of experiential learning, and that's something I talked about with your group earlier. And the idea here, I mean, I'm connecting it to the Team Monkey because I think that the need for sort of immersive learning and group-based learning and real-world type learning is a really felt need for people in higher education right now. And I think a lot of that has to do with what are the skills that they don't teach you in classrooms. They are very often these soft skills, and they're skills of interaction, they're skills of collaboration, of advocating for yourself and your ideas, of being sort of hopeful and entrepreneurial. And so these kinds of groups, the Hacker School, the Institute, which is an apprenticeship program, General Assembly, which is an immersive learning and workshop-based education program, these are springing up in sort of innovative areas of the economy to serve basically everything they don't teach you in school, which is kind of like the Team Monkey skill set. And then, this finally is an example of, what I call Team Unicorn. This is game-based assessment, and the picture here is from an assessment called a Choicelet, which was created by the AAA lab at Stanford University. And so nominally, this is a test of students taking photographs, and then they can evaluate their photographs. Nominally you're testing things like, is your photo in focus? Is it cropped correctly? What is the composition like? But what the test is really looking at is how good are you at generating lots of examples of work and then editing yourself. So you want to see a person probably who gives something a lot of tries and then is very good at looking at them critically and saying, photo skills, but to test your design thinking skills. And that's kind of an example of how Team Unicorn tests may end up working. So the idea here is to move, from the bell curve to the full rainbow of human achievement. That is what I talk about when I talk about the future of testing in the test. Sorry about the raggedy beginning, but that's basically the idea.
Sorry about that sound delay.
No problem.
So, Anya, for those that haven't read the book, talk about why you were compelled to cover this incredibly complex topic. I mean, wouldn't it be easier just to convince everyone to vaccinate their kids or solve the Middle East peace crisis?
I wanted to write a book about the future and the evolution of K-12 education and how it could evolve to better meet the demands of the 21st century, as we see, higher ed trying to do as well, because it's all part of the same system. But what I came up against again and again was that innovators were forced to the margins because of the incredible power of standardization. And so I saw that we're in the middle of this turning point where people are starting to understand that we impose these tests for reasons of rigor and reasons of equity, and there were mixed intentions behind it. There were both good and bad intentions behind it, but the reality is one of huge numbers of unintended consequences. And if you care about, thinking about what it really takes then you're going to have to deal with the metric that we're imposing because, for better or for worse, people optimize around metrics, and so the metrics are really, really important here.
Great. And talking about the history of the test, this was a section in your book. I thought I'm just going to have to trudge through this. I'm sure I'll pick something up, but I wasn't motivated to really jump into that chapter. But it was very eye-opening, and it shed so much light and really built the context for how we got to where we are. So, in talking about the history of standardized tests, what do you think is one of the most important things our viewers can learn about the history of standardized tests?
Sure. So I think the most important thing to understand is that psychometrics is a truly 19th century field, and it has its roots in the 19th century, even in the 18th century, and in a multi-decade project by psychologists to try to be accepted as scientists through the measurement of the human mind. But the human mind is so complex that we're very, very far away from truly scientific concepts and questions, and so we are kind of stuck with, I think, in some sense, outdated notions about intelligence and about human performance. So, and just to take a simple example, standardized tests in the United States are designed to measure proficiency at grade level, but there is no one definition of proficiency. Proficiency is decided by looking at the performance of large numbers of students over periods of time, and you get an average and it's good enough, but there's no real, it doesn't really account for individual variability. It doesn't account for the fact that people develop in different ways at different times, and we're actually still learning quite a bit about how the brain works, how math is learned, how reading is learned, and psychometrics is pretty silent on the issues of the current neuroscience discoveries of the brain. It's a statistical discipline. They don't know a lot about learning. They don't know a lot about teaching. So there's an incredible kind of divide where the tests are coming from a place that is very different from how cognitive scientists and teachers are looking at the process of learning, which is much more dynamic, much more social, much more embedded in interaction, and very difficult to kind of abstract and take out of context.
And that also brings up a point that I had no idea, and was pretty struck by the fact that standardized tests are standard in the test development, but what constitutes proficiency varies from state to state, and that was very shocking to me. So there's no level of proficient across the board across the United States. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because that was really striking to me.
Yeah, I was really surprised by this too. So, basically what I learned from talking to some executives of the testing companies was that, they, like Pearson or CTV McGraw-Hill, will create a test, they'll market it to states, and then the states will decide what the passing score in the test is, not the test company. And so you can sell the same test to two different states, and in one state the passing score will be 66, and the other state it could be 46. And they're giving the same test, but they're not holding students to the same standards. Now, the advent of the Common Core State Standards was exactly intended to overcome this issue. And, ideally, you have more states using fewer tests, they'll be able to converge on a single definition of what it means to be grade level. But again, there's a lot of questions being raised about whether the grade level determinations are developmentally appropriate or whether they're realistic and in any kind of way. But yeah, it's just a matter of saying, and it shouldn't be too surprising, educational accountability policy is set by politicians and it's not set by learning experts.
Right. We're going to take a question from the Twitterverse. This is from Jessica Miller, and she asks, what can we do to achieve a team unicorn style of assessment?
What can we do to advance a team unicorn style of assessment?
Right.
Yeah. That's a really interesting question. I think that at this point it's going to take a lot of creativity for teachers to figure out how to combine the data that they can gather in a classroom setting and use that to help augment a very rich picture of student performance. But a really simple example of that is I talk to students teachers using Google Docs. and getting students to collaborate on a presentation or on a document within Google Docs. And they said, you know, by looking at who made what edits when, I get a really good idea of who's participating in the group project and who's behind it, who's kind of slacking off.
Mm-hmm.
And I also get a sense by looking at the comments of the tone of interactions and whether people are, you know, highly participatory, if they're able to be constructive. So that's an interesting example of, you know, you can use this app, and it wasn't necessarily designed for learning or designed for testing, but you can use it to gather information. You could see someone using it in a conference with a student to say, you know, I see that you were a part of this group working on this document, but you only made 5 edits, and your colleagues made 20 edits. So what can you tell me about that process?
That's great, and on point to what my next question was, and I hadn't really thought about the application of Google Docs in terms of that context, but WCET's mission is to advance the effective use of technology-enhanced teaching and learning in higher education. Yeah. So our members are keenly interested in how technology can play a role. Talk more about the role of technology in the 21st century classroom and how it's going to facilitate us toward moving away from so many standardized tests.
So I've evolved in my own thinking about this, and I think that, you know, we can't be too hung up on the individual tools, but we have to think a lot more about the practices that are enabled by technology, because ideally we want technology to fade into the background, and, you know, education is going to remain sort of a human practice. And so when it comes to bringing us into sort of a 21st century learning and teaching, I find it's really, really helpful to think about the team monkey or the social and emotional type skills and the performance-based assessments, those goals of those assessments, and think about how you can bring those, translate those into an internet-enabled context. So, you know, with the example I used with Google Docs, it's not about the Google Docs, it's about how do we enable collaboration, how do we start thinking about generating a piece of text, and about editing as part of the process and revisions as part of the process. You don't just write something and turn it in and you're done, but you're going to get feedback from your teacher, you're going to learn to incorporate that feedback, you're going to learn to respond to that feedback, and that's all part of the process. And then in a similar way, when you think about performance-based assessments, I would always think about how can we use the web to invoke an audience for our work and to be able to present our work to in an outward-facing way, and so create a demonstration of learning to a professional community or to a network. And so, you know, a piece of student work, a culminating piece of student work, whether it's a photo essay or a research-based document, I believe can very often find its way to the open web, and there it can come up against an entirely different set of evaluators and set of feedback and audience. So those are some examples. I mean, the third example is the quantified teaching, right? So how can you use apps, use technology to get a more data-rich picture of all the many thousands of interactions that constitute teaching and learning? Whether that means you're timing students when they're giving presentations, or having them, you know, document the number of resources that they used or the number of page views that they got when they published something. So where does data come in? Where can analytics come in to help you make characterizations and draw evidence for student learning?
Right, and beyond the predictive side, which is really valuable. Here's another question from the Twitterverse. It's from Brian Warden. Who do you think is the appropriate body to determine proficiency, regardless of what assessment type?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think of education as a shared venture where there are many stakeholders, and I believe that all of the stakeholders have some reason to be involved in the determination of proficiency. In other words, employers have a huge need to understand what it means for students to be proficient and to set out and set forth their expectations of what they want new recruits to be able to know and be able to do. Parents have a need to know that their schools are helping students achieve real proficiency outside the communities maybe that they come from. And students obviously have a need, and teachers have a need. So I think that every group that wants to be involved in education and has a stake in education should be involved in determining what proficiency really means.
Right, and I think it's important that you reference the workforce, they're the ones that say you're not producing the students we really need in this 21st century workforce, but having them at the table is a really vital piece of the conversation.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how you hear from employers again and again that they want these soft skills, these non-cognitive skills, and these 21st century skills.
Right. In the section of your book titled Measuring What Matters, you talk about the future of e-learning in the 21st century, which is skills, social and emotional learning, and you look towards the novel solution, which some parents might react and say, oh no, I'm not sending my kid to school to do this, and that's gaming. Can you talk more about that?
Sure, absolutely. So there's two ways to think about the interaction between gaming and learning, or gaming and testing, sorry. One is, very simply, what do we learn from the experience of video games themselves? And what a lot of learning experts are getting interested in is the opportunity that games present to experience failure in the context of growth. In other words, games are sort of effortlessly adaptive. As you play a game, you move on through levels, and you can't proceed through the levels until you've completed or mastered one level. And in order to do that, when you learn how to play a game, you're going to die again and again and again. And so we want to incorporate growth mindset into our students' experiences. And games offer a beautiful opportunity to experience growth mindset. I know for a child like myself, who was always told that they were smart, I was given a very fixed mindset about what it meant to be smart. I never wanted to risk being outside my comfort zone or trying to learn something that I thought was going to be hard for me. And so I stayed, I made progress along a narrow track, but who knows what I could have done if I'd been, encouraged to think about, encouraged to fail, encouraged to try, and encouraged to think about growth. So students that experience, and you can offer them in classroom setting and maybe even translate those learning in the learning growth mindset, translate those into the classroom. The next level, what we're pushing into the frontier, is about game-based assessment, where you're actually embedding learning tasks inside a game, such as Blast Labs, SimCity, EDU, and the game is collecting evidence about the learner as the learner goes through the game. And so, that is next level, and those games are, elaborately conceived and created, but that's another way of looking at how games can induce the experience of learning and also measure that experience in some different kinds of ways.
Great. And the example used in the book I thought was spot on. It was one of the newer models of SimCity, and I think we've all had experience with SimCity. You try and build a city, and the city planners, and I'm sure you're experiencing that in New Orleans, they're saying, no, we need to look for the future, we need to look at the bigger picture, long term. You can't just build this house there because you like the spot.
Right.
Great example.
Yeah.
Another question from Twitter. This is from Jeff G. What were the biggest jaw droppers you uncovered when researching the book?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I didn't know that everyone talks about test anxiety, but I didn't know that there was documentation on test anxiety going back to the 60s, and that 25 to 40% of people experience test anxiety severe enough to depress their scores. And when you really start to think about the implications of that, I find it really mind-blowing, because we trust these tests so much. Your SAT score, your IQ score, your entrance exam to get into a gifted program. And if 1 out of 4 to almost half of people are going into that room and they're not performing in a way that really reflects their ability or their potential in other situations, how much talent are we missing out on?
Conversely, I think in some of the students I've talked to, they don't care about the outcomes of the statewide tests. They're more worried about their spelling tests, their math tests, and things like that. But they're also not from schools that are at risk of failing. And you had a compelling point in your book about a teacher in New York who went from being one of the highest performing to the lowest performing teachers in 1 year because she had the same group of students 2 years back to back. The first year they cared, the second year they didn't care, and I think that was really eye-opening to me, is how those students' apathy and exhaustion from taking tests really shapes the destiny of that teacher's future.
That's a really good point, and I think it kind of goes to the idea that test anxiety really becomes a school-wide phenomenon when you attach high stakes that affect teachers and school leaders as well. And as much as I visited this school that did a complete dry run of the state tests for over a week, and it was just for practice, just so everybody could get comfortable with the incredible disruption and upheaval of testing. And that's an incredible investment of resources for students that many of whom are struggling and need extra time for all sorts of things. And so the anxiety in that room really infects every single person in the school system, and that's how I talk about it coming to sort of define the experience of school.
Great. Another question I have, there's a little lull in Twitter, is do you think that we've reached a tipping point, or is the Common Core just going to push the apex further?
I mean, we're at a tipping point in the sense that the implementation of federally mandated annual standardized tests is currently being debated in Congress, and the House and Senate have both proposed eliminating that requirement, which would be a major sea change in how everybody from the top down addresses testing in schools. And of course, there are huge debates about it on both sides. So I think there is a tipping point. I think that we will continue to see this conversation push forward in the next few years. But the other issue is obviously the emergence of technology, and it's interesting for me to see how research scientists at Pearson and at ETS were very ready to admit that the tests they have on the market right now pale in comparison to what they could be doing if they had, in an optimal world of technology, the software, the technology exists today to get rid of the activity of stopping and testing in favor of testing growth. And what's missing is obviously the resources as well as perhaps the energy to transfer over into a whole new kind of testing.
Right. That was another one of my questions is, have you heard from any of the testing companies in this $2 billion industry since your book came out?
Not since it came out. I'm curious to hear what the head of Pearson thinks about it, because we did get on the phone and he did ask him about the pineapple question, which was a huge
right.
in New York State.
Right. Well, for those that haven't read the book, do you want to talk a little bit about the pineapple question? I thought that was just such a prime example of some of the weaknesses of the whole process.
Sure. So basically, this was appeared on, I believe it was the 8th grade reading test in New York State a couple of years ago, and it was a nonsensical fable about a pineapple challenges a bunch of animals to a race, but it doesn't run, and then the animals eat the pineapple, and then the question was, which animal was the wisest? And it's just an example of, I mean, it's a couple different things. One is they don't want to use copyrighted pieces of literature on the test because it makes it more expensive. So there's no Aesop's fables and there's no fairy tales. And so they created this adaptation, and it was probably written by sort of a temporary contract worker. But then because the test items are not public, they're not published, and teachers are not supposed to look at the test, they're not supposed to share it, this item actually made its way from test to test, and it was used for almost 10 years before it was actually protested and thrown out in New York State.
Thank you for going into detail on that. I didn't remember all the details, but I just remember being really struck by how that just epitomized everything that's sort of wrong with this process. So how do we go about holding states, districts, politicians, and federal government accountable too? As you say in the book, perhaps it's time to point the fingers both directions, and they need to provide resources, and it's not just the students and the teachers' fault.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the original intention of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965 was to allocate resources to poor schools and to minority-serving schools, because this was only a year after Brown versus Board of Ed, and separate but equal had been overturned, and our school system needed to address these huge inequities, but we've never really made a major effort on a national level to ensure that schools that are high poverty get resources commensurate with their needs. And in fact, only 14 states even attempt to allocate resources to schools based on the fact schools either get the same level of funding, or rich schools actually get more funding. And that's not even talking about the influence of, parent-teacher associations and other ways that schools can get resources. So resource accountability is the proposal or the idea of, let's make states responsible for inputs to schools instead of only making schools responsible for outcomes.
Great. And again, we have another lull in Twitter, so if there's people out there with questions, please go ahead and give those to us. We'll start wrapping up soon. My final question for you is, in reality, are we going to see any foreseeable change? Are administrators responsive to these opt-outs, or do you think we're being sort of like Sisyphus here?
I don't want to be too hasty or too optimistic in making forecasts. I think that there is I do see a true, authentic groundswell of opposition at every level. There are very, very few people out there willing to say that the laws we have on the books about testing and the amount of testing we're doing right now is completely appropriate, warranted, and necessary. Even the biggest critics of this book are able, or have to say, they have to qualify what they're saying to say, I see real problems with testing, and I think we're doing too much testing. Mm-hmm. So, without being overly confident in the rationality of our political and policy process, I do have to say that when something has zero fans left, then something in it has to change. And whether that's real substantive change and whether it changes in the direction of 21st century skills and properties or in the direction of equity, remains to be seen. But I am optimistic, at least, that we do feel like we're at a moment where a new set of possibilities and priorities are being put on the table.
Right, and I do think that people are galvanized and they're participating in meetings, they're being part of the conversation. So I hope by the time our little ones are entering school that there really is a swing in the other direction. And there is a need for assessment, absolutely, but it's a matter of what that looks like and what we really value as a society in terms of what proficient means and what skills we want these students to have. So those are all my questions. I'm going to go back to Twitter, see if there's anything out there, but you have any final comments or remarks?
I'm grateful for your audience's interest in this topic, and in the book itself, obviously, you can buy it at your local bookstore. You can holler at me, and I'll send you a signed nameplate. But yeah, I think it's going to take the concerted effort of everybody in the education community to really drive change forward and drive the discussion forward about testing.
Right. Well, good. Well, this was really useful and beneficial, and I'm so glad that I had a chance to read the book and have a conversation with you, because it was very eye-opening to me. And even coming from the higher ed world, I think there's a lot we can do on our end. So here's to keep pushing that big boulder up the hill, and we'll see where we can get.
Mm-hmm. What do you think that your community can do about this issue?
I think that's a really good point, and I think, our mission is really on the technology-enhanced teaching and learning and advancing effective policies and practices. So I don't think we can go to the institutions and say, really look at taking SATs and ACTs as just one metric when you look at admissions, but I think we can talk about, helping have all parties at the table looking for what kind of outcomes we want when we produce our students into the workforce, and tying that into the K-12 pipeline, making this a whole K-20 discussion.
Right. I think that's really powerful, because, when a school like MIT comes out and says that they're going to look at, ask people to taking a book of different kinds of assessment and saying, yes, maybe you have to hit this score, but that's not going to be enough to succeed in the 21st century. So I think that the higher ed world can do a lot to try to update people's thinking about testing and test scores. And I'm interested, I'm intrigued in the book by the example of the KIPP schools, the high-performing charter management organization considered to be at the forefront of teaching and learning, and produced really nice-looking test scores with low-income kids, but upon tracking the students into college, discovered that they didn't necessarily perform in college as well as their test scores looked like they would. So then they started to look at how do we cultivate these non-cognitive skills, and that's something that they're working on now.
Right, and then here's a question. WCET Hangout, just to be clear, you're not saying that the tests are the problem, it's the way they're being used and misused, true?
I spent a lot of time in the book talking about the stakes and the accountability regime and the unintended consequences caused by the accountability regime. I certainly believe that, there can be a role for standardized assessments. I don't think that they all need to be done away with tomorrow, but while we're looking at the assessment accountability regime, it's probably also a good time to ask, how could we update our tests? Are we really testing the right things in the right ways? And I think that there's a lot to be said. The science of testing is advancing, and the tests that we use in our schools don't necessarily always reflect that.
Right, and in your book you say there is a need for them. Maybe we look at 4th and 7th grade and not 30% of the entire academic year focused on standardized testing. So there's certainly a value there. We can't just write them off. Is there another question?
Improve education without writing off all tests. There are many tests that have been embraced for a very long time, like the NAEP, the Nation's Report Card. So yeah, I think you don't have to hate all tests in order to be critical of how they're being used in schools
today.
Right.
Great. And here's another question. This is from Brian Warden. I'm getting a lot of feedback. Brian's wondering, the movement in higher ed may cause us swing naturally to a point, but how do we bridge the K-12 and higher ed community?
Well, I know that there's a lot of conversation about this around the Common Core and the attempt, like the Lumina Foundation, higher education, what are they specific? So competency-based education in the sense of breaking out competencies and then talking about tasks or competencies. And so the more we start talking about that, I would guess that few of these competencies are going to be addressed or assessed correctly with multiple choice testing. And so as we start to make visible this practice and circulate best practices around defining and proving competency, I would expect that conversation to trickle down and influence the K-12 experience as well. And another simple way that they're going to interrelate to each other is with advanced students using online, in high school, using online courses and earning college credit and, participating in that way.
Terrific. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye.